There we go. So we are in chapter 17, page 72, right at the bottom of the page, talking about how you switch on your love of Hashem, right? Because it says that it's very accessible, that it's very close, that the Torah gives the impression that it's so easy for a person to be able to have love of Hashem. Well, is it really so easy? That's the question that we've been asking. Last week, we got our first clue. And we're going to take that clue this week, and we're going to develop it further. And our question this week that we have to focus on is, how do you get your head in the game? How do you get your head right? Because once you get your head right, everything else falls into place. That's the principle that we're working with over here at the moment, right? If you can get your head right, everything else will work. So, sometimes you see in the morning at davening, people come with their tefillin on their head, and they ask if you could, angle their tefillin correctly, because they're supposed to sit in the middle of your forehead. Bein einecha, it says, between your eyes. So people come often in the middle of davening and they say, just a point, like, are my tefillin straight? Sometimes the response is, the tefillin are straight, it's the head that's skew. So you got to make sure that you get your head right. If you can get your head right, everything else falls into place. So the only way that a person can develop a feeling of love towards Hashem is they've got to get their head right. That's what we're going to speak about today. Now, in order to appreciate what that means to get your head right, let's go back a step and try and understand what kind of love are we talking about. Because there's love that is very romantic, there is love that is very passionate, there is love that is very dynamic. That's not the kind of love that we say is easy to access. That's rare. For a person to have a very passionate, overwhelming sense of love for another person, or in this case for Hashem, which is even more difficult because Hashem is abstract, that's not easy. That's not accessible. That's not something that a person can just turn on at will. So last week we got our first clue, and that is that the verse that speaks about this love of Hashem says, Ki korev elecha adavar ma'oid. This love of Hashem is very accessible and close to you, beficha, in your mouth, uvilvavcha, and in your heart, la asoy soy, in order that you should do it. That's the key word over here. That's where we ended off last week. Because in order to get a person to do something right, to do something healthy, to do something that is associated with growth, to do something that is meaningful, in order to get a person to do something does not require this deep, passionate love. All it requires is enough, and we're going to put it now in quotation marks, enough love, enough drive, enough motivation that the person will say, I want to do this. So in other words, let's say, I had an interesting conversation earlier today where somebody said that their son, who is a university student, has decided that he wants to do an Ironman. Okay? So it got me thinking. People who do these kinds of things, people who do these extreme sports, people who run marathons, etc. Even the guy who goes to the gym, do they love it? Does a person love training? Have you ever stopped somebody in an ultra marathon, halfway through the ultra marathon, and say, are you having fun? Are you loving this experience? And generally speaking, not. Generally speaking, the only thing that a person loves is the sense of achievement once it's over. But in the now, in the race, in the pain, there's not much love going on. So none of us is necessarily running an ultramarathon anytime soon, and nobody's doing an Ironman. So let's talk about something which might be a lot more relatable to us, and that is, let's say that a person just has to go to the gym in the morning. Or, if you want to make it more relatable in terms of spirituality, the person who wants to go to shul in the morning. The person wants to go to shul in the morning. Can you imagine the job of a rabbi if, in order to get people to shul, had to first get people to be in love with shul? Imagine that. That would be a huge challenge. That would be a huge ask. Getting people to love shul, getting people to love the experience, that would be a massive undertaking, right? I don't have to do that. I don't have to get people to love shul. I just have to get people to have enough of that basic drive, that basic interest, that basic attraction, that this is something which is worthwhile, and then they'll come to shul in the morning. In the same way as when a person wakes up and they have to go to the gym. Obviously, gym and shul are very different, but the principle is essentially the same. When a person has to get up in the morning, they have to force themselves out of bed, and they have to go to the gym. They don't have to love the experience. They don't have to love the equipment. They don't have to love the routine that they're going to follow. But they have to have enough drive, enough interest, enough passion, enough attraction that they'll get themselves out of bed, and they'll actually go and do it. So there is a difference between passionate love and love that motivates you to action. That's what this verse is talking about. La'asoisoi. How do we get you to do the things that Hashem wants? Well, in order to do what Hashem wants, you have to be interested enough. It has to be attractive enough to you that you actually get the wheels turning. Now, to start that, to activate that process, to turn on that kind of dedication to Hashem, that is Korov Moed. That's very accessible. Any person can do that. Any person can do that. The only thing is, you've got to get your head right. So that's where we are in our conversation. How does a person get their head right? It's a good question, right? How do you get your head right? Especially when you're talking about something which is so spiritual, which is kind of abstract. How do you get your head right? That's the question we're going to be asking in this piece. So, as I pointed out, we're on page 72. We are at the bottom of the page. We're going to go back. When I say bottom of the page, we're going to go back to the third last line on the page. Reason being that that's where there's a nice placeholder. That's where there's a little period, a little full stop that will help us. Will help us just to see exactly where we are in the story. Okay? Ella. So the Alter Rebbe says, Ella. The way you can resolve this is de la soisoi, when the Torah says over here, la asoisoi, that the motivation of this love is in order that you should do what the Torah expects, right? So Loma, what the Torah wants to say at that point is enough love to get us to actually do the mitzvahs. This we did already last week. That's why I'm reviewing it rather quickly. So this is enough love, enough motivation, enough attraction, enough inspiration that will actually do what Hashem expects of us. Then we said, that is what we call the will of the heart that lies deep within the heart, hidden within the heart, and is not experienced in a tangible, expressed, open, personal way with the so-called flaming fire that we normally associate with passion. Now, this actually builds on what we learned in the previous chapter. This is not in a vacuum. This builds on the previous chapter. So let's remind ourselves a little bit of what we spoke about in the previous chapter, because it will help us. So what do we speak about in the previous chapter? We said that the ultimate state, spiritually, that each of us is supposed to look to achieve is called a Beinoni. And a Beinoni, even though the direct translation implies somebody who is average, a Beinoni is far from average. A Beinoni is somebody who has incredible self-control, incredible self-mastery. A Beinoni is somebody who doesn't step out of line, even though they consistently feel tempted to step out of line. The Beinoni remains focused on what is right in the world, even though they are constantly distracted by things that are wrong in the world. They stay the course. They know what they're doing. They're aware. They're focused. They are spiritually connected. So how does the Beinoni do that? So they get their head right. That's the key. The Beinoni has their head in a very healthy place. Now, in order to get to that very healthy place, 2 chapters ago, we said what you need is a lot of deep, prolonged contemplation about Hashem's greatness. Unfortunately, living as we do in the 21st century, the ADD generation, we don't know about deep, prolonged contemplation. We know about 15-second video clips. We know about TikToks. We know about, you can't even script these things, right? We know about sitting in a shiur and you get an urgent message on your phone that you have to reply to, right? So think about it. How difficult is it for us to be able to sink our minds into some prolonged meditative contemplation about Hashem's greatness? But yet, in chapter 15, we said that that's really, what you've got to be doing. That's the focus. That's where real growth and connection comes from. But then, in the last chapter, 16, We said, what about the people who can't get there or are not there yet, which effectively is all of us? Then what do? So we learned last time this principle that we're revisiting now, which is you have to have some kind of a diet of divine meditation that just at least gets you to acknowledge. So even if you don't feel, this is the separation we made, to acknowledge what is valuable in life. In other words, to acknowledge that it's a priority to have a relationship with Hashem, to acknowledge that mitzvahs are the most powerful experiences a human can have, even if you don't feel it. So we're now circling back to that. We're saying, how do you get it to be so close and accessible to do what Hashem wants? You have to activate this ru'usa deliba, this consciousness, this awareness inside your heart that says, this is where I should be. This is what I should do.
Is that what you were talking when you're referring to this meditation? Is it a state of meditation?
Okay, so I'm very wary of using the word meditation because for most people it already has an overtone. And here we're talking about a very specific process that is called hisboinenus. Now, hisboinenus could be translated as meditation. Could be. And maybe there are certain hisboinenus practices that are technically meditative, but just to distinguish between what the world knows as meditation and what Hasidus teaches as hisboinenus, that's why I prefer not to use the word meditation. Again, that doesn't mean that there's no room for meditation in Judaism. It doesn't mean that this is not a meditative practice. But hisboinenus is a deeply intellectual experience as opposed to other forms of meditation that are often about losing the intellectual process so that you can be in a so-called Zen state or whatever it is. So that's the distinction over here. So the distinction is we're talking about thinking deeply about a focused concept for a prolonged period of time. Okay. That's what we're calling hisboinenus over here. And that, we say, is not necessarily accessible to all people. And that's why you need the shortcut version, which we learned about in the previous chapter, that we're referencing again now, and reiterating with a very important take-home that's going to emerge in just a moment. What's that take-home? So this is basically to say what you should actually be doing. So what should you actually be doing? Let's have a look. This concept of being able to access that awareness, in other words, to, again, reiterate, to get our heads right, to the extent that we have this awareness inside of ourselves, the value of Hashem, a relationship with Hashem, and doing mitzvahs, etc. That is Korav Mo'ed. That is incredibly accessible. V'nokel l'chol adam, and is easy for any person, asher loy moyach b'kod kodoi, who has a brain inside their skull. Now, as soon as I say that, you remember that, because that was an unusual expression. So you remember that from last week. Okay? That's as far as we got last week. Now he's going to justify why this is the case. And what we're about to learn is one of the core principles of any self-mastery. By way of introduction, it's not unusual in today's world for people to play victim. In fact, I think it's become quite popular. It's just a question of what you're a victim of. So this person is a victim of law enforcement. Can't believe it. What is this? Who do they think they are, the police, to treat me this way? Right? Other people are a victim of the structures of society. It's completely unfair that some people have more wealth than others. So I'm a victim because I haven't been as successful as somebody else. Or the victimology around conditions. And there are now more conditions available than ever before in history. Now, once upon a time, it was really simple. People were either normal or they were not normal. In today's world, there's a whole lot of conditions. This person has an issue with that, and this person has an issue with this, and this person has that phobia, and this person has this issue. And you know, if you don't have an issue, you obviously don't know yourself. You have to find your issue, you have to embrace your issue, and you have to be victimized according to your issue. So, the point being that the whole victimization, the whole victimology of society is all built on a principle that says we don't have the ability to rise above whatever life has thrown at us. Right? So if you had to use as a comparison, and I'm sure there'll be many people who have very strong views about this, And it's an unfair comparison because it's not everybody had the same experience. But I can just tell you from my own experience, and you might have similar experience, that you meet people who were Holocaust survivors. There's no question about it that they had some very deep-seated issues having come through the Holocaust. Whether you want to call it trauma, whether you want to call it the survivor's guilt, whether you want to call it deep grief and loss, mistrust of humanity, there are many, many, many options. And many of these people came out with many of those options that they were living with. And yet, it's an incredible concept. And the world was a different world, obviously, in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But there isn't a movement to protect Holocaust survivors. Have you ever thought about this? There's no classification of people who went through that kind of trauma and pain. Many of them never ever went for any kind of psychotherapy. Again, it was a different world at the time, acknowledged, but there was also a different resilience to those people. For me, thinking about somebody, and there were many, you might even know some of them. Think about somebody who was born in a DP camp. Just think about that for a moment. Born in a DP camp. What that means is, either by some incredibly remote miracle, both spouses survived and then decided to continue to have a family, which would have been extremely rare. The much more common version was that people met in a DP camp. In order to be in a DP camp meant that you were rescued from the inferno. That means that that a person who was in a DP camp was in the first couple of years after the most horrific event in living history, living memory. The resilience of people under those circumstances to meet other people and make a commitment to start a life together and to bring children into what so many people could easily call a cruel world, that tells you that they didn't play the victim card. It was a different mindset. They didn't even have the luxury of claiming victimhood. They had this urgency to move forward and to rebuild. So the concept of the modern mindset that makes people so weak, where everybody is, not everybody obviously, but where so many people are so easily hurt and offended and dislodged and undermined, frankly, by many things that should never dislodge healthy people. That is because we've played up this whole victimology. Never, poor you. Person had a difficult upbringing. They came from a lower economic class, or whatever the case is. Therefore, we excuse either behaviors or inadequacies or whatever the case is, rather than encouraging people to say, well, you can be something different. So all of that boils down to this principle that we're going to learn now, which is very, very important principle. What's the principle? Ki moichoi birushusoi. Your mind, your moich is actually your brain, your mind is in your control. This is one of the most important, if not the most important lesson in any kind of personal development. Your mind is in your control. Moichoi birushusoi. Your brain is in your control. Most people don't feel that. Most people go from one experience to the next saying, the reason I feel this way is because of, and then we immediately deflect outside of ourselves and blame some external circumstance. That's why I feel this way. That's why I'm not successful. That's why I'm impatient. That's why I'm distracted. That's why I succumb to temptation. Because of that stuff that's out there. Whereas the cornerstone of all personal development is moichoi birushusoi. We get to choose our mindset at any given time. That's a very powerful thought. So you could have multiple people experiencing the same external factors in their lives and they could be living in completely different worlds. Because it all depends where their mind is. So the person who doesn't take any responsibility for their thought processes, for their mind, that person is completely vulnerable to whatever's going on. Whereas the person who understands Moichoi Bereshusoi consistently tells themselves, hang on, I can shift. So now I don't remember the name of which of the hostages it was that recently had an interview. And in that interview he said he had never, it doesn't come from a religious background, he had never studied Tanya ever in his life. While he was being held hostage, his mother was studying Tanya. Now I don't know if she had started before or if it was only at that time, but she was studying Tanya and she came across this principle. The principle, as the Alter Rebbe will call it, Moyach Shalit al Halev, that the mind rules the heart. So she was learning about this, and he tells the story that there he was in Gaza, and he got this like the sense in his head that I have to get my mind to control my emotions. It's almost like they had a telepathic connection. I have to get my mind to control my emotions. At some point, they took him. They obviously dressed him up in some way that nobody would recognize that it was a hostage. And they led him through the streets, and they landed up depositing him in some building, just in a room, and the door of the room was not even locked. And there he's sitting, and he's not quite sure where he is, what he's supposed to do, why he was moved to this particular place. And the next thing, a guy walks into the room and sees him there, and gets very aggressive, starts yelling at him, who are you? Where did you come from? Why are you here? And he realized that this was going to escalate and could potentially be really dangerous, because if he would now expose that he was Israeli, the next thing the guy might call in his mates and they could lynch him. It wouldn't be the first time such a thing had happened. So at that point he remembered this thought process that he had over the last while, whatever period of time it was, that your mind should be able to control your heart. And instead of getting flustered, he realized he had one way that he could think of to protect himself. So he started to act as if he was mentally unstable, just like making strange noises and speaking gibberish and whatever. And they let him go. The guy, this aggressive guy, just like left the room and left him as he was. So this principle of using his mind as a tool to take control literally saved his life. Literally, in that situation. So here the Alter Rebbe is telling us, Moichoi Bireshusoi, that is a natural state as a human being, is that we have power over our own minds. And therefore, that means that a person can choose to focus their mind, to contemplate, or if you want to use the word to meditate on, any principle that they choose to. It's a fascinating idea. You know, there was this the professor of anthropology, and he would always come to his first lesson at the beginning of the year in this big lecture hall. And the lecture hall had, like they usually do these kinds of ceilings, with the tiles, exactly like we have here. So in the first lesson, he'd always say to his students, please look up at the ceiling and tell me what you notice. Inevitably, the students would say, oh, there's one tile that's not placed properly. It's kind of a little bit out of the framework. And that's inevitably what everybody would say. And he'd use this to launch his course, because he said, look at that. Everybody notices the one tile that is not placed properly and doesn't pay attention to the other 99 tiles that are perfectly placed. We choose what we're going to focus on. That's just the human condition. We choose what we're going to focus on. The other day I saw a video clip. This rabbi from Belgium, Rabbi Shabtai Slavatitsky, is a very inspiring Chabad rabbi in Antwerp. So he shared a video clip where there was a man who wrote a letter to the Rebbe, and he wrote that he's living in Jerusalem and he has 10 children and he's battling financially because he's got such a large family to support. And as you well know, to eke out a living in Jerusalem is not so simple. So this is what he writes to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe writes back to him, what an incredible bracha that you have a happy and stable marriage. What an incredible bracha that you have a beautiful family. What an incredible bracha that you can live in the holy city of Jerusalem. End of the letter. P.S. P.S. After the letter. P.S. If a person shows gratitude for the brachas in their life, that opens the channels for more brachas in their life. You know, here the person is saying, this is my issue, and I'm battling with this issue. In other words, my whole mind is focused and consumed on the financial pressure. And here the Rebbe is telling him, you could shift your mind. Instead of living in a world of financial pressure, you could live in a world of joy. You could live in a world of privilege. And through that, bracha will flow. So every person needs to know that we have the freedom to choose what to focus our minds on. Your brain is in your control. To use the brain as a tool to focus and meditate on anything we choose. Therefore, what should we be thinking on? I wonder, it would be a fun and a very disturbing exercise if we had a way to do an audit of what we spend most of our time contemplating. Notice I'm not using the word thinking about, because thinking could be very superficial. What do we spend most of our time contemplating? So I'll give you an example. You know that story, maybe I told it last week, I don't remember, because I know I told it in other shiurim, so you'll excuse me if I repeat it. But you know that story of the kid who comes home from school, and waiting at home is the grandfather who's sitting in a rocking chair. And the child comes to the grandfather and says, you won't believe what we learned at school today. So what did you learn at school today? We learned that every single day the sun loses hundreds of tons of mass. And at the rate the sun is going, in 1 billion years, the sun is going to fizzle out. And then we're all going to die. So the grandfather sits up in his chair and says, what did you say? So the child repeats. The sun is losing mass every single day. In 1 billion years, ois, finished, kaput, we're out of here. So grandfather sits back with a big sigh of relief and says, sure, I thought for a second you said 1 million. And the point is, how much, if we had to do an audit, how much of our time do we spend contemplating things, many of which are negative, that most likely will not have a bearing on our lives? Many, many years ago, when we had just opened our shul, there was a fellow who used to come. It was the funniest thing for me. He used to come to us regularly for Shabbos, and when I would see him out at the end of the meal on a Friday night, very often he would look up at the sky. Now, most people today in the modern world do not contemplate the stars very often. He would look up at the sky, and I thought, okay, maybe he's got an interest in astronomy, or maybe he likes to navigate using the stars. I don't know exactly what. So he'd look up at the sky, and he would tell me, one day, a meteorite is going to hit, it's going to destroy us all. It's 26 years later. I'm not saying it's never going to happen, but that's 26 years of obsessing about the end of humanity in a fireball that could have been used, that brain could have been used in a different way. Agreed? Could have been used a different way. So we laugh at it until we realize we're all doing exactly the same thing. Every one of us has some kind of track of obsessive thoughts that suck the life out of our brain because we're thinking about those things. So you're telling me that I should love Hashem. How could I love Hashem? Do you understand how scary the world is? Do you understand how terrible people are? If you're not depressed, you don't understand the problem. Here we are, the human beings, we are destroying the world. Climate change, it's you and your aerosols that will spell the end of us. I'm not sure if it's 1 billion or 1 million years, but that's what's going to happen. We spend our lives obsessed with such negativity. How could you possibly come to love Hashem under those circumstances? So once a person realizes that that your mind and the way the mind operates, and more importantly, what the mind chooses to focus on, is a choice that I control. I don't have to obsess just because it happens to be, at the moment, the popular issue that everybody's obsessed with. I don't have to obsess with something because I'm wired in a particular way, that I'm an anxious person, that I'm a vigilant person, that I'm a depressive. I don't have to go that route. I don't have to focus my mind that way. I could choose to train myself to think repeatedly and in a focused way on something healthier. What's healthier? So he explains. If a person would choose to contemplate about Hashem's infinite greatness, that's a nice alternative, by the way. That's a great alternative to all the other things that obsess our minds. Instead of thinking about the government and the crumbling infrastructure and rising anti-Semitism and the potential of a nuclear war, God forbid, and climate change, and who knows what kind of gender your child could tomorrow come bring home and say this, this is the new version or whatever. Instead of thinking about and contemplating and spending so much time about and so much brain space on those things, we could think about Hashem's greatness. And we don't. I know it sounds cliched, because it is a cliche, but very often cliches capture things that are truths. You know that cliche that says, instead of telling God how big your problems are, tell your problems how big God is. Spend some time thinking about Hashem's greatness. We don't do it. We open up a siddur, we read the words, we zone in on the piece that sounds like it's relevant right now. So if I know somebody who's not well, I get very focused at the paragraph about healing. And if I'm under financial pressure, I become very focused in the section that says, please give us sustenance in this year. And so it goes. But all the other major chunks of davening, which speak about how great Hashem is, which speak about how Hashem creates the world effortlessly, how Hashem allocates all of the energy and resources that everything needs in order to exist, that I gloss over at high speed. I used to think that the bullet train was in Tokyo. Then I worked out that it's in Shachris. So we're not misboined, we don't stop to think. It's a fascinating concept. And because it's so normal, because this is the society in which we live, and everybody around us is doing the same thing, we don't stop to consider that there's another way to live. So misboinen b'gedulas ein soif baruch hu. To spend some time, it doesn't have to be hours in a day. We're not talking about being a Benoni at that level. We're talking entry level. A few minutes each day, just to consider Gedulas ein soif baruch hu. Hashem's infinite greatness has the potential to radically change our lives. Radically. Not partially, not marginally, radically. Because when you go about something you never think about, to something that you create consciousness about, it shifts everything. So what happens to us? We drive down the road, and all we think about driving down the road is one of the following topics. Am I going to be on time? Am I not going to be on time? Or, all of these other people on the road are all meshugayim. There are no normal people on the road. These people are halfway in my lane. Those people are driving too fast on my tail. Those people are driving too slow in front of me. What am I contemplating? And I don't know, the untold hours that we spend every week behind the wheel. So what am I contemplating during all of that time? How bad things are. Imagine if a person, before they got into, imagine you did this. Here's an exercise. Imagine a person gets into the car, and before they turn on the ignition, okay, you turn on, it's very hot at the moment, so turn on so you have the aircon, okay? Before you put the car into gear, imagine you spend 30 seconds considering Hashem not only created everything, but Hashem creates everything in all of its specific detail at every moment. In other words, whatever I'm going to encounter now in the next 5 minutes that I'm in my car is being currently created by Hashem for a purpose, and I'm part of that purpose. Can you imagine how different the drive would be? Imagine a person starts the day, instead of how we normally start. How do we normally start the day? Well, the first thing we do is you've got to check if the world is still there. That's why most people check their phone. They do a very thorough check of every social media site before they get out of bed, because they have to work out if it's worth getting out of bed. I don't know, maybe the world's still no longer standing. Maybe they've blown each other to bits already. Maybe there's some new dread disease that they've just uncovered and are going to have to walk around with masks again and social distancing or whatever. I'm going to just check. Then I get out of bed, right? That's after the first ritual. The first ritual that we do is the whole internal debate of whether or not it's worth waking up. Should I wake up? No, snooze and put this and whatever the case is. By the time we finish all our morning rituals, got so much negativity brewing inside of us, then we roll out of bed and we start thinking, oh, this is what I have to deal with today. There might be some things on my agenda that I'm looking forward to. Inevitably, there'll be things on my agenda that I'm dreading. How is a Jew supposed to start the day? Moideh ani lefanecha. That's a moment of meditation. Not just a blub. It's a moment of meditation. Thank you, Hashem. That's why I'm here. I'm not here to make a buck. I'm not here to get more followers on Instagram. I'm not here in order to irritate a family member. I'm here because Hashem, you decided I have to be here. That means you decided I have value. My life has value. I can achieve something and I can build a relationship with you. 30 seconds of that contemplation. What kind of a day is a person going to have? If they think about that. That's what he's telling us over here. Our mind is in our control. Can we switch like this? No, of course we can't. We have to habituate. We have to train ourselves. We have to start in increments. You've got to do this for 5 seconds in a day. Got to really work on it. Make a reminder, a trigger, some kind of an association. So no, when I wake up, however we get ourselves, whatever the methodology is that we use, but everything shifts once we start to pay attention to the fact, Gedulas Ein Sof Baruch Hu, that Hashem is infinitely great and invested in me. Hashem has decided to give me the opportunity to live, the opportunity to serve, and therefore the opportunity to connect. If I could think about and contemplate those things, what a different life I'm going to live. So am I going to be in love with Hashem with a passion? No. Am I going to have enough love of Hashem that I realize, I'm valuable and this relationship is valuable? Yes, I will. I'll live differently. But I first have to acknowledge that I have agency. That I could get my head right. I could think differently. I could process differently. I could perceive differently. So if a person does this exercise, if a person invests in this kind of meditative contemplation, then memela, you hear that word? It's an incredibly important word. Memela, automatically. See that? Automatically, as soon as I shift gears in my brain, automatically, at least my brain will feel an attraction to Hashem. My heart may not feel it yet, but my brain will feel it. That means to say, I will value that connection. And if I value something, I'm going to invest in it. I'm going to chase it. I'm going to pursue it. I'm going to do it. And that will then encourage me to want to connect to Hashem through doing His mitzvahs and through studying His Torah. You see that? It's the kind of love that I meditate on. That is, beficha, first I learn about it, because I have to have information. That's beficha, because we said that Torah learning is associated with the mouth. In order to fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah, you actually have to say the words. Then take that information that I've studied and put it into my heart. That's the meditation. And through that, at least, at the very least, I'll be motivated to do what I should. And that's the purpose of being human. That's why we're here. That's why we're here. Because there's a verse in the Torah that says today, which means in this life, in this world, our job is to do what Hashem wants. That is the purpose. When we say today, we're referring to this experience of living as humans in a world that is governed by action. So this is the time for action. And tomorrow, which is a reference to the world to come, then we can enjoy the fruits of our labor. But why are we here? Now we're here to do. And therefore we have to come up with methods and strategies to be able to do more, to be motivated to do. What is that method and strategy? Get our head right. Spend some time thinking about Hashem's greatness instead of, as we typically do, spending all that time thinking about our troubles. It's a really practical take-home that each of us can learn and can apply. Next week, please God, we're going to just talk a little bit about the mechanism of how the brain has so much power to control the way that we feel and experience life.